Good call. So my name is Dr. Jim Schroeder. I'm the Vice President of the Department of Psychology of Wellness here at Easterseals Rehabilitation Center. And I am joined with Dr. Jamie Gaither, our postdoctoral fellow for this year. And again, we're excited for you to join us. This is really kind of a great opportunity to get some of just, I think, what is really great and just wonderful science out there to the community. One thing we want to let you know, and I'm holding this up right now in front of me, is that much of what we'll be talking about, kind of the framework, is based on a book called Unselfie, and the subtitle is Why Empathetic Kids Succeed in an All About Me World. It's by Dr. Michelle Borba. So you can find this on Amazon or any other site pretty easily. It's a great book. Myself and Dr. Gaither having gone through it, there's just a lot of information there, some of which we'll cover and some of which we won't be able to. But if you're interested, certainly kind of get the book and you can follow along as we go through it. What we'll also do, though, is we will send out a handout of key points after each meeting. So our educational coordinator, Macy Eggeman, will send this out to you so that you have that kind of on paper just to kind of refer back to. So, as a beginning, what we want to first do is we're talking all about empathy, right? And before we can talk about something, we really have to kind of define it in some ways. And so when we talk about empathy here as part of this series, I think one of the best ways to think about this is it's really trying to put yourself in another person's shoes, right? We're talking about it as it relates to our kids, but it could be also your coworker, your friends, it could be anybody. And the key thing about empathy is that just because you put yourself into another person's shoes doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to respond in the way that they want you to respond. But what it does mean is that you strive to understand the context of where they're coming from and the experiences that they've had, right? And one key point, and we'll talk about this throughout, is that none of us can ever truly understand what it's like to be another person. I think one of the worst things we can do is to say, oh, I know what you're feeling, even though we do that sometimes just to try to be kind. The reality is we never can know what someone's feeling, but the key here throughout this whole series and the whole idea of why this is important is we can make that attempt, right? And that's the beginning of where we'll go from here. But to contrast a little bit with empathy is different than sympathy, right? In that sympathy is feeling sorry for someone, which might be great in certain situations, but not necessarily truly trying to understand the context of where they're coming from. So sympathy and empathy overlap, but are not the same thing. And certainly empathy really is very different from apathy, which apathy is a sense of kind of indifference or just being uncaring. And really it's kind of the opposite end of the continuum from where we're at now. So with that, I'm going to let Jamie kind of dive into what's really the first key around teaching emotional literacy as it relates to empathy building in our kids.
All right. So as Jim kind of mentioned, first of all, let me know if you can't hear me. My computer just is struggling today. And I move around a lot. But like Jim kind of mentioned, the first and most important thing in this series is that we want to make it accessible and reasonable for you, whatever kind of role you take as a parent, educator. And it's important to know that within this book, within what we talk about, within the information we'll send out, the goal of this is to encourage you to make small actions and changes over time that will build up this capacity within yourself and within your kids and the kids you work with. And this book that we're going to use, just kind of want to provide some background. I think it sets the stage well. Dr. Borba does this work because of what she felt like was a big gap in the kids that she worked with, not having these basic skills. Empathy has decreased significantly in the youth of today. This me-centered culture that especially this young generation has, I maybe can even include myself in that. Kind of that decrease in empathy has really led to an increase in peer cruelty, in bullying, and kids these days just simply have moral reasoning, and their ability to kind of empathize with other kids is simply going away. And she really attributes this in large part to our plugged in, highly competitive, highly self-focused culture. And Jim and I have many conversations about how we can change that ourselves. It feels like a big undertaking to say, I'm going to have the cultural revolution, but it is those small changes over time within the family.
And I think too, maybe kind of one note around that is the idea, and I didn't mention this earlier, but as a father of 8 kids myself from the ages of 3 through 16, there's a lot of things that are hard to teach. I mean, there's some things that are very much ingrained, whether it's genetically, biologically, but one of the great things as we go forward is that empathy is something that is very teachable. And what we found, and Dr. Borba found, is the fact that no matter where you come from, kind of the context of your early experiencing and your early life, empathy is really accessible. And that's what makes it exciting for us to say it's not only really important, but for us as parents, for us in any domain here, it's really a teachable kind of entity, which is great.
Yeah. And so one of the first things that we're going to talk about is that idea of emotional literacy. And as Jim said, it's kind of overlooked. We think it's something that just develops. Our kids know when they're happy, they know when they're sad, when they're mad. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of kids don't learn these things. And it's something that we don't really think to teach them as parents, as teachers. But I think I can speak from my little limited experience in that a lot of places where we start with kids in our office is emotion identification. Where do you feel this? What is happy? What is sad? And what you can do in your own homes is kind of begin at those basic steps. Emotional literacy is the first step that you kind of have to have. If you aren't aware of how you feel, how could you be aware of how someone else may be feeling? If you can't identify how your own face looks or how your facial expression displays how you feel, how can I read my brother's face or my peer's face or even my parents' face to understand how they're feeling?
And what's interesting about that too is that there are a lot of situations, and even in our own homes, where I think sometimes kids feel as if they're not allowed to feel a certain way. Like, for example, if they get in trouble for doing something after they got angry, kids will universally sometimes tell us that they think that anger was the problem, that they got in trouble for being angry. And one of the things that we really, through this whole episode series, want to engender, and I think is a key initial point for all parents, especially, is to say to our kids, hey, your feelings are your feelings, and that's perfectly fine. And identifying them is really important. Remember, we're not angry or frustrated about your feelings. It's more of what you do with the feelings that obviously matters. But I think a lot of times, Jamie, as we're talking about this idea of emotional literacy, kids intentionally or unintentionally get the message that they're not allowed to feel a range of feelings. And then what happens is not only does that limit their ability to manage and identify their feelings well, it actually limits their empathy for others because they're not able to see others for the feelings they're having instead of just seeing the behaviors. And that kind of is a very limiting factor.
For sure. And so much of how we all learn is this process of social learning, is that I am learning from observing other people and also seeing the consequences for their behavior. So maybe I've never hit somebody when I was angry, but I saw my brother do it, or I saw that other kid in my class do it. But if I don't have the emotional literacy to say hitting is bad, but angry isn't bad, then I'm just saying, okay, anytime I feel this urge, this anger in my body, I'm not able to appropriately deal with that. And that's just kind of the basis of, what we do. No big deal. No, I'm just joking.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to really make, as parents, really an intentional effort to tune in, not only to how our kids feel, but also how we feel as adults. Emotion coaching is really how we do this. And it seems like really maybe a big ask to say, coach your child in how to feel or how to display or identify their feelings. But essentially what it is just reflecting their feelings back to them when they are experiencing something.
And I want to
comment. Yeah.
Provide a note to that. One thing I tell parents, and this is actually comes out in some other area of research, is that there are times where emotion coaching is not possible, right? So let's say it's too busy, or there's an emergency, or let's say there's a lot of other people around in a public situation, or even you as a parent listening, you're just too dysregulated to be able to do that. And so one of the things I tell parents is that while we want to increasingly gravitate towards emotional coaching, it's perfectly understandable and okay to say this may not be the time to do it. And as a parent myself, I've come in the situations a lot where I thought, you know what, that was just not the proper place, or I just didn't have the time to do it. But I think what we find is that the more you're aware of this idea that Jamie's sharing, is that the more you start to see situations where you think, oh, just a minute or two right there was an opportunity to coach that I, wouldn't have thought about before because I just wasn't at that place. But I think it takes the pressure off parents to think there's no way I can do this all the time. And you're right, you really shouldn't do it all the time. But there are situations that we'll talk more as we go forward when it's really available to you.
And to bounce off of that comment, with most things that we teach in our psychology practice, it's easiest to do a new skill when you're calm, whether it's deep breathing or mindfulness or feeling identification. So one of the things that Dr. Borba advocates for is that you should really practice these skills with your kids almost as part of like a routine during the day that just becomes a part of life. So whether it is, and we'll talk more about some of her really good ideas that she has, but again, this is not the time where your kid is having a tantrum in the grocery store. You say, it looks like you're feeling angry. I think, we're past that at this point. We're managing the situation. But there's other opportunities when there's a lot less of that kind of emotional charge. So I want you guys to just think for a minute. We don't have to share, but as adults and parents, I want you to think about how open you are with your own kids about how you feel on a regular basis. Just take a minute and reflect on that.
Yeah, and as I'm thinking about that too, and others are reflecting, it's interesting to think it's easier to be open about the positive emotions that we feel or those that we're comfortable sharing. And I'm sure for those of you listening, you can also think about the times where you think, oh gosh, being open puts me in a vulnerable state. And I think that's one of the things that often deters us, well, not just as parents, but as people in general, is the thought that if I am open, oh gosh, that means I have to, truly kind of open myself up. But the reality is that as Jamie's sharing this, one thing we want to kind of point out is that the process of being open is first what we would call an intrapersonal process, meaning you don't have to share everything with everybody. Of course, that's not even healthy anyway. You first have to be internally open to the idea of even being aware of how you're feeling. And then from that point, you can always decide how much do we share, what's appropriate with my kids or others. But oftentimes we're even kind of closed off to our own emotional state. And that really limits our ability to teach empathy to our kids in general.
And I agree. I think there is a fear among adults that if we share too much about the negatives or positives, it may be, oh, I don't want to get into the work stress with my kids, or I don't really want my kid to understand that I'm fighting with my partner or with their teacher or whatever it is that's going on that's causing you to feel a certain way. But at the end of the day, whether we teach our kids intentionally or not, they pick up on those things. They may not be able to talk about them or adequately process them, which may get us into some trouble, but they notice that something has changed. And again, like Jim said, this doesn't require you to say, yep, today my boss called me in and da 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 da, right? Of course, we're not going to have that conversation with our 6-year-old, but what we can say is, mommy is feeling angry. And when I feel angry, my face feels hot. Or I can tell that daddy is sad right now because he wants to be left alone. How do you feel when you're sad? Do you feel like you want to be left alone? Oh, okay. Well, let's respect dad's feeling and leave him alone, and you and I can da da da. And it's a really quick way where you're kind of acknowledging, you're not like, yep, dad is really sad because he lost, his favorite ball at the golf ball court. Not necessary. But we're kind of just filling them in on like, this is an action, but there's a reason behind it. And then evoking that conversation and saying, how do you feel when you're sad? Or what kinds of things make you angry? And it doesn't just have to be with negative emotions. It can also be about happy, positive things. So I notice you're really excited that we're having mac and cheese tonight. How do you feel? What is your body telling you? Or mommy's really happy that you cleaned up your room on the first try. And when I'm happy, I feel calm inside or I feel relaxed. So you kind of have to build up that feelings vocabulary and then use it with your children kind of at every point, turn possible way. But it doesn't just have to be sharing the reason why. It can be sharing how your body feels, or it could be sharing that you're proud of them for using those vocabulary.
Yeah, the two key things I really like as we're talking about this, and again, reflecting on my life as a parent, is that one, what we're doing is that we're making our feelings and emotions relevant in our home. And that might sound kind of funny for some of you listening, but what I mean by that is that there's lots of different things going on in our lives that are relevant. What's going on with school, and what's going on with, sports, and what's going on all these domains. But the reality is that, how we feel about things is as important as anything that ever has existed in our, social lives. But we don't often necessarily, through what we discuss, make it relevant, right? We just kind of, it's part of how we coexist. But I think that many of us grew up and in situations where it just wasn't really explicitly brought out as being something important. The second thing I think I really like when we talk about this is that we are taking what we call the elephants running around the house, meaning, as Jamie was saying, even preschoolers pick up on emotional states and emotional patterns. And we're allowing those elephants not to be running around, like, and no one really saying something, but just say, hey, you know what, we're bringing these out. And we want this as a family that ultimately, as kids are growing up to be adults themselves and have their own relationships, we want to create an environment where we are facilitating really healthy social emotional growth for a lot of reasons. And I think that doing these things makes a difference at the base level.
Yeah, so I feel like we've spent some time just talking about why it's important and what it kind of looks like. But what I want you guys to be able to take away from this is like, how do I make this happen? And why isn't it already happening for me? And one of the key things, as I kind of mentioned before, is this idea that, and going off of what Tim said, we have a lot of things that are very pressing in our world, not by our own choice, right? Work takes over more than we want it to. Our children have school, and then they have homework, and then they have extracurricular activities and church obligations and all of these things that seem to be the next thing we have to do. And Dr. Borba kind of advocates for this idea of taking an opportunity to unplug and be present. And that, I think, is one of the hardest things we can do, but it doesn't have to be something that you do for 5 hours a day. It's as simple as getting face to face with your child without any distractions. So I'm not texting on my phone, the TV's not on. I'm not, got my AirPod in my ear while my kid is telling me about their day. So we kind of have this time that's just for human connection. And that barrier that we kind of have allowed in our society to take over really limits those opportunities for conversation of, I am feeling overwhelmed, or mommy is very sad. And that when we kind of take away these 4 T's, as she calls it, kind of like this texting, talking on the phone, working, TV time, all of those things, when we take them away, we kind of remove the barrier to this face-to-face focus on feelings and kind of expression of an emotional state.
And I want to say something real quick, as you mentioned, Jamie, that sometimes parents feel like there's no way I can fit all this in, even though I know I want to spend more time with my child and spend more kind of direct one-to-one time. The beauty with our kids, especially, is that even if you do this at 5 minutes at a time, or even if, we really do need to carve out more, but anytime you disconnect and you truly lean in, you truly allow for that connection to occur, even in a very small amount of time, it matters. It makes a difference. And our kids kind of recognize that. And so oftentimes I think that parents feel a lot of pressure to do everything. And I felt that myself, as a dad. But what I've recognized is that our kids are kind of wonderful, because even a brief time to do this, even a few minutes to go out and throw the football around or whatever it is, in and of itself is very valuable. And so it's not, even though the time has to be created, it really is the quality of that interaction that makes a difference here.
Yeah, I would definitely agree in this situation. Quality is more important than quantity, although we don't want to say we did it once and we checked it off the list.
Right.
But if we're doing it within an activity, as long as we're not doing it while we're, stuck in traffic and driving, even something like we're playing a game, or one of the great suggestions Dr. Borba has is to read books together and really comment on the emotions of the characters and why or why not the situation could have been different if they had a different feeling or a different behavior. A really great suggestion that I think would be actually a lot of fun would be to watch a silent movie. They have so many great kids movies, and put it on mute and just kind of watch the cartoon and say, like, oh my gosh, what do you think that guy is thinking? How do you think, Mickey feels when Donald Duck, comes into his house without talking first, or whatever those silly situations are. It can still be a kid-friendly activity. It's not like we're sitting down and saying, okay, Johnny, now tell me how you feel. But really just incorporating that into everyday things that you may already be doing together. Bedtime is a great opportunity for checking in. Usually, hopefully, it's an unplugged time where you're reading a story together, you're singing a bedtime song, and you can allow for that face-to-face connection. So I want to respect time, and we're going to kind of wrap up here in a few minutes. And I want to just kind of check in. We've talked about a lot today. Jim, do you have any kind of ideas or suggestions?
Well, no, I love just the idea. Again, we're kind of just creating, in some ways, almost a new vocabulary, kind of a new framework for our homes when we allow all this to run through. And the other thing we're doing is we're making this interesting and fun, right? I mean, this is one key that it's so easy to get lost with us as parents when we're trying to do the things that we are supposed to do. But learning about our lives, like the social emotional world, should be fun in a way that other things are fun to learn about too. And I recognize, it's not always going to be just as fun as, something that the kid loves completely. But what we're trying to do is to say, hey, this is really kind of interesting. Like, even let's use an example you were talking earlier about using more emotion words. And our kids, let's say they were angry about something, but they've calmed down later. And you might ask your child, so what were you feeling during that time? And they're like, oh, I was so mad about that. Well, what you realized was even before they were mad, they were disappointed because let's say it was something they wanted to do that led and it didn't happen. And that led from a disappointment to anger. Teaching our kids like, oh, here's a cool new word for you, even to younger kids. So I think you were kind of disappointed, right? Because it was something that you were looking forward to and it didn't happen. All of this is just creating a new shared experience and a new shared vocabulary that's making kind of life more interesting, to be honest, in many ways.
Right. And so I think one of the biggest things is to just think about kind of your digital habits and really reflect on how you're using your time day to day, because we all have obligations. Those don't go away. We all have things we have to do and that our kids have to do. But again, as we've said, if you can increase the quality of the interactions that you do have in those times, you can get a big bang for your buck. And I think you'll see changes not only with your kids, but also just in general with yourself and your ability to tune in to others, as you kind of more intentionally put those things at the forefront of your focus. So moving forward, this feels like a lot. And there's just some key questions that I want you to think about as we move into the week and over the weekend until our next session. Is I want you to think of one or two things that you might think about. This could be reasonable for me. I can turn my phone off while I'm cooking dinner and cook with my kid, or I can turn the TV off a few minutes early and we'll read a book together. Maybe my kid's older, so we're reading a chapter book. And think about who is it going to be? Is it just you and one child? Is it the family together? Is it parents individually? When are you going to do it? What works within your family's schedule? Not everybody's bedtime routine is a routine. All kids have different needs that they have. So when will this work for you? It's not going to be the same for everybody every day. And where? Is it going to be, at bedtime in mommy's room, we all get together and talk? Or is it going to be at the dinner table? What are those, where are these conversations going to happen? And then the big key here is why. Why is this important? Why is this change going to help me? Really kind of anchoring yourself in that so that when you're feeling flustered, you're like, we don't have time to read a story, or I'm too upset to deal with it. You can at least remember why it is that this is an important thing. And then to give yourself some grace. This is new. It's really hard to make these changes. But those are some key questions that can help you kind of make a concrete goal or a concrete idea rather than just saying, oh yeah, it would be nice to talk to my kid about this more. So as we wrap up, I'll let Jim kind of give any final thoughts, and yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I have for today.
I think my final thought is life is an adventure. And, this is a great way of looking at just kind of one more opportunity to connect with those we want to connect with the best. And you know what? Just kind of learn together. And so thanks for everybody joining us today. If you happen to know anybody that would be interested in hopping on even, the second week and going forward, we're certainly open to that. But we're just excited to kind of work with you and get the word out about how important empathy is and how accessible it is for our community. So I hope everybody has a great day, and we will see you next week. Thank you.
Look for that worksheet or look for those notes in your email. And then if you have any other questions, you can email Macy and she will let us know. We look forward to seeing you guys soon.
Thank you, everybody. See ya.
Have a great week.